Hi, this is Paul Palmer. Today's today's video is a little bit different to some that we've been sharing recently. I want to talk about the blame culture and the impact that it has on a business. So, of course, as you know, I'm primarily focused on pharmaceuticals and medical devices, but it applies really anywhere where you have a team. So, what do we mean by blame culture? Well, the first thing, of course, is when something goes wrong, you look to find who to blame. Whose fault is it? And in many cases, unfortunately, I've seen they either get disciplined or fired. But is it really the best approach to running a company? I don't think so, really. I always think that if somebody's done something wrong, why? What's the reason for it? Now, if they're incompetent, or maybe you've employed the wrong person in the first place, well, maybe they do have to go through the disciplinary route. But in many cases, I find the blame culture is not valid because maybe systems and processes in place are not as good as they might be. The recruitment process doesn't ensure that the people that are new to the business are supported, and many other reasons. But how do you find out? How do you work out whether you've got a blame culture? Well, really, if often you're saying it's either some sort of retraining for the employee, the individual that did it wrong that particular time, or you find somebody who's done something each time a customer complains and you fire them. Well, that's probably an indication that you've got a blame culture. So what's the impact of something like that? Well, on the people that are within the organization, on your team, on your employees, if you've got a culture that looks for fault rather than root cause, then often you'll find that people don't tell you when something goes wrong. They'll just cover it up. They'll push it in a corner, they'll put it in the cupboard, they'll file it away, they'll archive it quickly because they realize something they did 2 weeks ago wasn't quite right as it should have been. And then maybe in 3-4 months, maybe 6 months, you get a complaint about that issue that's already hidden, and you look for the cause. And you find the individual that did it, and they still get into trouble anyway, which is why they hid it in the first place, because they were going to get into trouble. But what really should they have done? Well, they should have fixed the problem at the time. They should have put their hand up. I did this wrong. We need to sort it out. And then you could have fixed the problem and you wouldn't get the complaint from the customer. What else? Well, if you're looking at root cause analysis, maybe you've got a deviation, and you find that the problem, when you investigate, relates back to an individual. And you say, right, it's their fault. But then next week, it relates to a different individual. So you blame them next time. And then the next week, it's 2 other individuals. So far, you've now fired 4 people. Or you've blamed 4 people and demotivated them and reduced their output because they're worried about doing something wrong. Now, saying that, I'd like to give you a small example of how this caused a company from a person I was working with. I'm sorry, I'm trying to make sure I don't give the name. So he was working for a company and doing the bare minimum to make sure he didn't get fired. He didn't want to get blamed for doing something wrong. So he just did whatever he needed to do so that the KPIs that were being measured didn't identify him as an underperformer and then have to leave the company. Instead of taking a few risks, doing the job to the best of his ability, and maybe occasionally not quite doing something right because the systems were not in place well enough, or maybe his improvements to the processes, maybe 1 in 10 of them were not perfect. So he got the blame for that change. So the company didn't achieve as high a result as it could because the efficiency improvements didn't get put in place. They didn't get the output they should have from this employee because he was scared of doing something wrong. But they still had to pay him. And this paid him was what you might class as a C-level team member, when he could have been a B or an A. An A being the highest performer, achieving the best results, B intermediate, and C a classification for the lowest. So have a look at your culture. See what it is that happens when something goes wrong. Do you look for the first person and blame them? Or do you do a full, detailed root cause analysis? Do you look at whether it was the training that wasn't adequate enough? Do you look at the recruitment process? Maybe the specification wasn't good enough. Maybe the interview had some issues, but they were the only one that you could find, so you took them on anyway. Maybe it's just the procedure they were following. Maybe they weren't trained fully. Maybe nobody verified their competence. Maybe they just couldn't do it. Okay, so that's it for me for today. Watch out. If you've got a blame culture, it can have a bigger impact than you realize.